Ornamentals? That what we're calling it now? Kids turning a working section into a garden. A crop that takes 3 years to pay you isn't a crop. It's a debt. Elijah Carter was 19. He just covered the worst dirt in the county, ground that blew across the road every spring, with thousands of thorny bushes nobody could name. He didn't argue. He kept planting. 3 Augusts later, they turned orange. By 8 one morning, 3 vehicles sat in his yard. A juice producer, a health food company, a skincare buyer who'd driven 200 miles. Nobody laughed. Respectfully. The store in Bozeman opened at 7 in the morning, but the pallets arrived at 4, and for 2 summers Elijah Carter was the one who met them. He drove in from the east in his grandfather's truck with the heater going, worked the dock with a box cutter and a price gun, and by the time the first customers came through the doors with their canvas bags, he had already emptied the cartons, faced the shelves, and broken down the boxes out back. The job paid a little over minimum. Nobody else wanted it. He took it because it was the only work in that valley that ended at 7 in the morning, and his grandfather needed somebody at the house in the afternoons. What stayed with him afterward was not the work. It was the shelf. There was a section in the back corner, maybe 4 feet wide, where the small bottles lived. Oils, powders in dark glass, juice that cost more per ounce than the gas it took to drive it there. He labeled them with a gun that punched out stickers, and some of those stickers said $40 for something that fit in his palm. The first time he assumed he had misread the sheet. He checked it twice. Then he set the bottle on the shelf, stepped back, and looked at it the way a person looks at something that hasn't started making sense yet. The customers asked him things. Where the berry came from, whether the oil was cold-pressed, whether it would do what a woman's sister said it had done for her. He learned which answers were true and which ones the labels were only implying. And he learned that the difference did not slow anybody down at the register. He did not have a degree in nutrition. He had never taken a class in it. What he had was 2 summers of watching exactly what people were willing to pay for, and why, and how thin the story on the front of a bottle could be and still hold. Home was 75 acres an hour east, out where the hills opened and the wind came down off them with nothing in the way. The Carters had been on that ground for 3 generations. Eli's great-grandfather had put his name on the deed at a time when very few black families in that part of Montana were able to, and the family had understood ever since that the paper mattered as much as the dirt. His grandfather, Walter Carter, ran cattle on it for most of his life. He was not a large operator and never tried to be. He knew his fences and he knew his water, and he knew, in a way he never explained out loud, roughly how much the place could carry before it started to complain. When his health went, slowly, then all at once, he could not keep it up. He leased the pasture to a neighbor with more animals than the neighbor had grass for, and the neighbor kept them on it too long, and then kept them on it longer. Eli saw the results every time he drove in from a night shift with the sun coming up behind him. The grass on the high ground had gone thin and patchy. Bare places had opened where nothing was holding on. In spring, the wind picked the loose soil up and carried it toward the county road in a haze you could see from a mile out, and when it rained hard, the water ran across the surface instead of soaking in, cutting narrow channels through the fields on its way to somewhere else. He knew what he was looking at, more or less. He did not know what to do about it. That was the shape of him at 19, and it would have been obvious to anyone who thought about it for a minute. He could tell you what a bottle of berry oil sold for in Bozeman, and who bought it, and what they wanted to hear before they did. And he had never in his life brought a single acre of anything to harvest. He had helped his grandfather with hay. He had fixed fence. That was the extent of it. And nobody in that county was going to call him a farmer. Not at 19. Not with a night stocking job and a grandfather in decline and a lease running on the back of the place. When men at the feed store talked about the Carter ground, they talked about it the way people talk about weather that hasn't arrived yet, as a thing that would resolve itself, one way or another, without anybody having to say how. He understood, in a way that would matter later, that the shelf in Bozeman and the bare ground east of it were connected. He just could not have said how. The bottles came from somewhere. Somebody grew what was in them. Nothing on the label ever mentioned the dirt, and it had never occurred to him, standing there with a price gun at 4 in the morning, that anybody would want it to. Walter Carter died in March, in the house he had lived in for most of 50 years, with the ground outside still frozen hard enough that the burial had to wait 11 days. The will was short, and it was clear. It had been drawn up by a lawyer in Livingston 9 years earlier and updated twice, and it left the 75 acres, the house, the barn, and everything in both of them to his grandson, named in full, with no room anywhere for interpretation. Walter had been particular about that. He had watched what happened to families who left things to be sorted out later. Ground that got divided among cousins nobody could find, then sold out from under all of them by a court because no one could agree on a fence line. He had told Eli once that the fastest way to lose a place was to die without saying who it belonged to. Eli had been maybe 15 and had not understood why the old man brought it up at a barbecue. The lease ended with him. The neighbor pulled his cattle off in April, and for the first time in 6 years, the Carter place stood empty. And Eli could see all of it at once. It was worse up close. From the county road, the high ground had only looked tired. Standing on it, he could see that the bare patches were not patches at all, but one long area that the thin grass was merely interrupting. The wind came off the hills in the afternoon, and he could feel grit against the side of his face. Along the west edge, the ground had a hard crust on it, and where the crust had broken, there were channels a hand deep, running downhill in the direction the last rain had gone. 3 weeks after the funeral, the county sent a letter. It was not a threat. It was an assessment, printed on both sides, listing the parcel and the improvements, and the amount due in November. And it did not care at all who had died or when. Eli read it at the kitchen table with his coat still on. The number was not enormous. It was simply larger than what a person makes stocking shelves at night. Once you had also paid for insurance, propane, and a truck that was going to need a transmission before Christmas. He had somewhere to be, was the thing. Since the previous fall, he had been holding a seat in an apprenticeship in Billings. Diesel and heavy equipment. 3 years, paid from the first week. A trade that would still be worth something when he was 50. He had earned it himself. He had a letter with a start date in September and a phone number for a man named Ray Whitfield, who had told him, in the tone of somebody who had said it to a lot of 19-year-olds, not to lose the letter. That was supposed to be the whole shape of the year. Walter would get better or he wouldn't. The lease would run, and in September, Eli would drive east with a duffel bag and start being something. Instead, he was standing in a kitchen in April, holding a tax assessment for 75 acres that were coming apart in the wind, and the letter from Billings was on the counter behind him. And both pieces of paper were about the same size. He went out that evening and stood at the west fence until the light went orange and then gray. Nothing about the place looked dangerous. It just looked like it was leaving. A dry ribbon of soil lifted off the high ground and moved across the road and kept going. And somewhere on the other side of those hills it would come down on somebody else's field, and no one would ever know it had been his. He had come home for the only reason he had never wanted. Now the place he had come home to was asking him a question, and the deadline on it was printed in a letter on the kitchen table. The first offer arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Dale Brenner ran better than 4,000 acres north of the Carter place and had the kind of voice that made everything sound like it had already been decided. He did not come to the house. He caught Eli in the parking lot of the hardware store in town, shook his hand, said something decent about Walter, and then named a figure for the whole 75. House, barn, ground, all of it. It was low. Eli didn't know much, but he knew what dirt went for in that county, and it was low by a third. Brenner didn't pretend otherwise. The ground was blown out, he said, and everybody knew it, and at his age, a person ought to be glad somebody would take a problem off his hands. A neighbor named Ed Fowler came by a few days later with a different version of the same idea. Keep the house and the yard, sell the back acreage, save yourself 10 years of trouble. When Eli didn't answer, Fowler reached for the sentence people in that county seemed to keep in a drawer for occasions like this one. "You've got feeling for this place, son. Feeling doesn't pay property taxes." His mother, Denise, was not sentimental about it either. She had spent 2 years driving out on her days off to check on Walter, and she had watched the place wear him down from the inside while it wore down from the outside. And she was tired in a way Eli could hear over the phone. She wanted him in Billings. She said so plainly once, and then never brought it up again, which was worse. "That ground took everything your grandfather had," she told him. "Don't stand there and let it take you too." So there were 3 roads, and he could see all of them. He could take Brenner's money, drive to Billings in September, and be a man with a trade and no land, and nobody anywhere would ever say he had made a mistake. He could farm it the way it had always been farmed, which meant fertilizer, fuel, irrigation, and equipment, which meant borrowing. And he had already sat across a desk from a loan officer who was polite for 11 minutes and then explained, without ever using the words, that 19-year-olds with no operating history do not get that number. Or he could do something nobody around him had done, on ground nobody around him wanted, with money he did not have. What he had instead was smaller, and it was finite. The cattle were gone and were not coming back, which meant the working chute, the squeeze, the hay equipment, and the older of the 2 tractors were all going to sit in the barn rusting on his behalf. He sold them in 1 weekend to 3 different buyers and put the money in an account with the modest life insurance check that had come through in May. And then he sat down and looked at the total. It was enough to do one thing well. It was nowhere near enough to do everything badly. He was in the barn looking for fence pliers when he found the notebooks. 11 of them, stacked in a wooden crate under the workbench, the cheap kind with cardboard covers, every one full of his grandfather's handwriting. At first he thought they were weather logs. They were more than that. Walter had spent 30 years writing down where the wind ran hardest in April and where it broke, which draws held water after a storm and which ones shed it, where the snow drifted and where it stripped clean, which corners came back green first and which ones came back last. He had mapped that farm 1 page at a time without ever calling it a map. And in the back of every book, on a page ruled off by hand, was a column of numbers with a date beside each one. It took Eli most of an hour to work out what he was reading. Topsoil. Same 4 places once a year, every spring, a spade and a tape and a number written down. The early books had 1 figure. The middle books had a smaller one. The last book had a number less than half of where the column started, and under it, in handwriting gone shaky, 3 words. Still going down. Eli sat on the barn floor with the book open on his knee. His grandfather had known. For 30 years he had known in inches, and every spring he had written it down and put the book back in the crate and gone out to work anyway. He had not been ignoring it. He had been watching it happen, and had been too tired or too alone to start the whole thing over. Which meant nothing about the place was a mystery. Walter had already done the hard part and left it in a crate. Somebody just had to act on it. For the next several weeks, Eli walked the property every morning with the last notebook in his jacket and a pencil behind his ear, checking his grandfather's pages against what was in front of him. The wind ran where Walter said it ran. The water went where Walter said it went. He dug holes across the fields and compared what came up. In one stretch, the ground was packed so hard the shovels skidded, and in another, the top few inches came out the color of ash, and both of those places were circled in a book from 9 years ago. The worst of it was the west side, where the hills let the wind come down with nothing to slow it. That was the piece Brenner would have paid the least for. That was where Eli decided to start. In the second week of May, he called Ray Whitfield and told him he would not be coming in September. Whitfield asked if he was sure. Eli looked out the kitchen window at the worst-looking ground in the county and said he was. He did not plow. That was the first thing people noticed, and it was the thing they could not get past. A man taking over 75 blown-out acres was supposed to open the ground. Eli left most of it closed. He spent $40 on soil tests before he spent $1 on anything else, and when the results came back, he laid them over his grandfather's pages and divided the property on paper into zones, not by field lines, but by what the ground was actually doing in each place. He spread compost only where the tests said it would earn its cost, which turned out to be a fraction of what he had assumed. He drilled grasses and low cover into the worst of the bare areas. He left the old crop residue lying where it was instead of raking the fields clean, which offended people almost personally. From the road, it looked like neglect wearing a plan. Then, in late May, a refrigerated truck came up the driveway carrying trays. Hundreds of trays. Thousands of plants. And what was in them was not impressive. Each one stood less than 2 feet. Narrow leaves, pale stems, a gray-green cast that made the whole load look like something scraped off a riverbank. The driver had Eli sign for them, looked at the west field, and did not ask what they were for. Eli set them out by hand. He ran a line, measured, walked, knelt, and did it again, day after day, along the west edge where the wind came off the hills. He mulched every one. He ran drip line down the rows because the young plants would need water for the first 2 seasons whether he had it to spare or not. He built deer barriers that were not good enough and would have to be built again. It took him 11 days, and by the end of it his knees had stopped registering as part of his body, and the account with his grandfather's equipment money in it was most of the way to empty. Tom Keller watched from the county road for most of an hour before he came over. Tom ran cattle on several hundred acres 1.5 miles north. He had known Walter Carter for 30-some years, had pulled the Carter truck out of the ditch more than once, and believed, not maliciously, just completely, that he understood that particular ground better than the young man now standing in the middle of it. "What exactly are those supposed to be?" Tom asked. Eli kept working. "Bushes." "I can see they're bushes." "Then we're making progress." Tom didn't smile. He walked a little way down the row, looking at the pale things standing in their mulch, and asked how long before they'd produce anything worth selling. "Probably 3 growing seasons," Eli said, "if they establish." Tom turned around at that. "3 seasons," he repeated, in the voice of a man giving somebody one more chance to hear how it sounded. "And what was he supposed to live on in the meantime?" Eli pushed soil in around the base of another plant. "Good decisions, hopefully." That was when Tom said the thing that stuck. "A crop that takes 3 years to pay you isn't a crop," he told him. "It's a debt." And then, because he had earned the right to, and because he thought it might land, "Your granddad never owed anybody a dime." Eli didn't answer that. He would carry the sentence around for 2 years, taking it out and looking at it more often than he would have admitted. The county filled in the rest. At the feed store, a man asked whether he was going into ornamentals. At the diner, someone said the Carter kid was turning a working section into a garden. Ed Fowler's opinion, delivered secondhand, was that the boy had found some farming trend on the internet, invented by people who had never wintered in Montana and never would. And underneath all of it ran a different sentence. One Eli heard often enough that he eventually stopped reacting to it at all. "Give it a few years," people said. "That ground'll change hands." They didn't say it as a wish or an insult. They said it the way they said it was going to be a dry July. He rarely argued, partly because arguing with a feed store is a losing proposition, and partly because he knew the plants weren't magic. They would need water while they established. They would need pruning, protection, patience. Some would die, some would grow crooked. And because the species came in male and female, and only the females fruited, he had to lay the rows out so the wind that had been stripping his farm would carry pollen through them, which meant a planting pattern that made no visual sense from the road and would have to be right the first time because a mistake there wouldn't show up for 3 years. But he had reasons, and they were not sentimental ones. The roots would hold vulnerable soil. The plants could take a Montana winter and conditions that would put most fruit crops on the ground. Mature in rows, they would slow the wind coming off those hills before it reached anything else he might ever try to grow. And the last reason was the one nobody in the county would have guessed, because nobody in the county had ever worked the back corner of a health food store before dawn. He was not planting a conservation project. He intended to sell the fruit. He had spent 2 summers putting price stickers on this exact berry, on the oil, on the powder, on the little dark bottles of juice, and he had watched people carry them to the register without blinking. He knew what it was worth. He just had to keep it alive for 3 years to find out if he could grow it. The first winter came in harder than the forecast said it would, and it stayed. Eli walked the west rows in February with a shovel handle to knock snow off the barriers and could tell already from the color of the stems that he was going to lose some. He lost more than some. Cold took a share. A drip line cracked underground where he couldn't see it and ran dry through a stretch he'd assumed was fine. Deer got into a row before he improved the fencing and worked it end to end with a thoroughness that felt like commentary. By the time the ground thawed and he could count honestly, he was down close to 15% of everything he had put in the ground. He replanted. There was nothing else to do with the information. That same spring, he did the other thing, the one nobody saw. He took his grandfather's spade and his grandfather's tape out to the same 4 places, measured, and wrote the number in the back of the last book under the shaky handwriting. It was smaller than Walter's last figure. He had expected that, and it landed anyway. 3 seasons of roots was what the column was waiting on, and he had one. He was also by then driving again. The store in Bozeman took him back on nights. The manager, a man named Curtis Pryor, had never entirely understood why Eli left and was glad enough to hand him the pallets. So the shape of that year was 2 hours in the truck each evening, a shift with a box cutter, 2 hours back with the sun coming up, and then whatever daylight he could stay awake for. He fixed the fence himself. He rented equipment instead of buying it and returned it clean, on time, because a 19-year-old who returns things clean gets to rent them again. He sold a little hay off the least damaged corner of the place, which covered the propane and not much else. His mother stopped talking about selling. She also stopped asking about the bushes, and Eli understood exactly what that meant, and neither of them said so. Tom Keller drove past one afternoon that spring and found him setting replacements into the gaps. He pulled over and got out, but didn't come far. Still think this is the plan? Eli looked down the row at the empty spaces, which were the only thing about the field a person could see from where Tom was standing. It's still the plan. Then came the second year, and the ground answered before the market did. It happened in pieces too small to photograph. In May, a storm came through that would have carved the west slope open the year before. Eli had walked that slope after every rain since the funeral and knew its channels the way you know a scar. He went out when it cleared, expecting to find them deepened. The water had gone somewhere. It hadn't run. Behind the shrub rows, where the mulch and the grasses had knit into something continuous, the soil had simply stayed where it was. The wind kept coming off the hills. That didn't change and wouldn't. But along the west edge, it no longer arrived at the ground with the same force. Eli found that out with his hands, kneeling in the lee of a row on an afternoon that was tearing at everything on the high ground and finding the dirt beneath him dry, packed, and still. There were insects in the rows that summer, more of them and more kinds. Birds started using the shrubs for cover and then stayed. Under the mulch, when he dug, there was a dark, crumbling layer, perhaps the thickness of a fingernail that had not been there when he started. Organic matter. 2 years of it. None of that produced a check. All of it told him the system had started running. The first call came in August of that second year, 12 months before there would be anything to sell. The man on the phone introduced himself as Marcus Dowd and said he bought fruit for a juice producer close to 200 miles west. He had heard from a nursery supplier that somebody out in that county had put in a serious block of sea buckthorn. Eli had not told many people the name. He hadn't hidden it exactly. He had just answered bushes so many times that the answer had become a habit. And it had not occurred to him that his own seedling invoice was a public document in a small industry. Dowd wanted numbers. How many female plants? What ratio? When did Eli expect fruit? And was he thinking fresh market or processing? Eli gave careful answers and no promises because he had exactly 0 commercial harvest behind him and knew that the fastest way to be finished in a specialty market was to commit to a volume and then not have it. Then Dowd asked one more thing, easily, almost as an afterthought. "Who do you work for out there?" Eli looked out the kitchen window at the rows for a moment before he said it. "It's my place." There was a small adjustment on the other end of the line. Not hostility, nothing you could have written down. Just a man reordering something in his head. Dowd said that was great, said he'd follow up in the spring, and did. 3 weeks later, an email arrived from a natural products company in Colorado asking whether he planned to press any of the seed for oil, and mentioning that they were looking 2 and 3 years out because their current supply came from overseas and they didn't love it. Then a small food manufacturer wrote asking about frozen puree and whether he'd consider contracting acreage. From the county road, the field still looked like a wall of gray-green brush that a foolish young man had planted instead of doing something sensible. Nobody at the diner had revised anything, but the market had found him a full year before the fruit had, and the calls kept coming, and Eli started keeping a list of them in the back of his grandfather's last notebook, on the page across from the column, because it was the closest thing he had to evidence. Something had shifted, and he could feel it even though he couldn't have named it. For 2 years, the only question anyone had asked about him was whether he was out of his mind. That question was over. The new one was harder, and it belonged entirely to him. The plants were going to fruit. Could he actually bring it in? Obstacle 2, 823 words. By the start of the 3rd summer, the shrubs stood shoulder-high in places. The rose had become the first thing you saw from the county road, a long, dark ribbon running the west edge where 3 years earlier there had been nothing but blowing dirt and a fence. The roots were into that ground now in a way Eli could not have pulled apart with a tractor. And there was still nothing to sell. That was the part nobody warned him about. That the hardest stretch would not be the winter he lost 15%, but this one, with everything visibly working and the bank account behaving as if none of it existed. The plants looked like an accomplishment. They were not an accomplishment. They were a bet that had not been called yet. He had taken the spring measurement again in April out of stubbornness more than hope, and the number had gone down for the 2nd time in a row, by less than before, which was either a signal or a rounding error, and he had no way to tell which. In June, a woman from a supplement brand out of Austin drove up to look at the block. She walked the rows, took photos, asked good questions, and then, back at her car, made him an offer that had nothing to do with berries. Her company wanted to build the launch around a story, she explained. Regenerative, single origin, young grower, Montana. She wanted to know if Eli would be comfortable with the word superfood on the front panel, and with some language on the back about cellular aging and immune support. Nothing outrageous, she said. Everything phrased carefully, the way everyone phrases it. That version of the product would carry a meaningfully better price, and she said the number out loud. And it was better by a margin that made Eli's stomach move. He thought about the shelf in Bozeman. 4 feet wide, back corner, $40 bottles. He thought about the woman who had come in 10 minutes after the doors opened, while he was still breaking down cardboard, and asked him whether the oil would help her sister. And how she had asked it. Not the way you ask about a product, the way you ask about a rope. He had been 17 and he had not known what to say, and he had said something true, and she had bought the bottle anyway, and he had thought about it more than he'd expected to. He told the woman from Austin no. She was not offended. She asked what he did want on the panel, and Eli told her that it was a nutrient-dense fruit, grown on a farm being rebuilt from the soil up. That the fruit was tart and strong and difficult and worth it. That was all. That was true, and it was the only thing he had that no one could take back later. She said she'd think about it. She didn't call again that summer. Tom Keller made his last run at him in July, on an evening when Eli was walking a drip line with a wrench looking for a leak he could hear and not find. 3 years, Tom said. You've spent 3 years growing a wall of thorns. Eli found the fitting, knelt, and worked it. It's a useful wall. Useful doesn't mean profitable, Tom told him, and it wasn't cruelty. It was almost the opposite. He was a man watching somebody he had known since childhood do something he was certain would end badly, and he had run out of ways to say it. No, Eli said, but profitable doesn't have to mean destructive. Tom crossed his arms and looked down the row at the gray-green wall of it, going on and on toward the hills. Then he asked the question that was the actual bottom of everything he'd been saying for 3 years. Did Eli honestly believe people were going to pay real money for a berry they had never heard of? Eli tightened the connection, felt the line firm up under his hand, and stood. I think the right buyers already have, he said. Tom left unconvinced. He would have said if anybody asked him at the feed store that week that Walter Carter's grandson was about to learn something expensive. And he would not have been entirely wrong, which was the part Eli couldn't have known yet. Because for all the calls in the back of that notebook, for all the emails and the ratios and the careful answers, everything he had built in 3 years now depended on a thing he had never once done. He had grown the fruit. He had never taken it off the plant. It started so quietly he almost missed it. In the last days of July, he found berries tucked in tight against the wood, small and hard and pale, easy to overlook unless you were the kind of person who had been looking at those particular branches every day for 3 years. Over the next 10 days, the color came up. Pale went yellow. Yellow went gold. Then, across row after row on thousands of plants at once, the gold went orange. A saturated, ridiculous orange, clustered so densely along the branches that the leaves disappeared behind it. The wall that had been gray-green since the day he set it out looked, from the county road at 4 in the afternoon, like it was on fire and not in any hurry about it. People started slowing down. Then they started stopping. A woman who taught out of the school in town called to ask whether she could bring a group out to see it, and Eli said yes without really hearing the question. The county paper called. Marcus Dowd said he was sending a buyer. The natural products company in Colorado asked for samples of fruit that was still on the plant. A skincare brand Eli had never spoken to found his number somehow and left a message about seed oil. Tom Keller drove past twice in one day. Both times he slowed. Neither time did he stop. And that was the moment the whole thing turned over, because seeing the fruit and getting the fruit were not the same activity. And Eli found that out with his hands in the second week of August. Sea buckthorn does not let go. The berries grow crowded along the branch, in among thorns, with skins thin enough to break under the same pressure it takes to detach them. Picking one at a time worked and took roughly forever. Pulling burst them. Every week he left them out there cost quality, and the fruit would not hold on the plant past the first hard frost, which in that county could arrive any time after the first week of September. He had 3 weeks, probably less. He had read every method he could find over 3 years and had tested exactly none of them at scale, because there had never been a scale to test. The only approach that worked at all was the one everyone in the industry used and nobody described honestly. Cut the fruiting branches, freeze them hard, and knock the berries off frozen, when they'd release clean instead of turning to mash in your hand. Which meant he needed people. And cold. He did not have either one. Cutting a block that size by hand was a crew's work, and a crew is a payroll, and Eli's money had gone into the ground with the plants 3 years earlier and had not come back out yet. Freezing it was worse. He had a chest freezer in the barn that his grandfather had used for a beef quarter and some perch. What he needed was a reefer trailer or a walk-in, and 2 solid weeks of it, right now in August, in a county where every cold unit and every set of hands was already committed to somebody else's harvest. He started calling. He called the 2 custom crews within reach. Both were booked into September, and one of them told him, kindly, that he should have booked in March. He called a produce hauler in Belgrade who had a trailer and a schedule and no room in it. He called a cold storage outfit that quoted him a number for the season that was more than the fruit was going to bring. And Eli did the math on the back of an invoice and thanked the man. He called a dairy about a bulk tank. He called 2 farms with orchards on the other side of the pass and left messages. He called Dale Brenner, who had cold storage sitting empty until his own harvest, and Brenner was perfectly polite for 4 minutes and then explained that he was going to need it. He called the store in Bozeman and left a message for Curtis Pryor that he was half embarrassed to leave. And on the second day, out of something he wouldn't have called hope, he called Tom Keller. And it rang until it stopped, and no one picked up. And Eli sat with the phone in his hand for a while afterward. So he went out and did it himself. The first night he cut until 2 in the morning with a headlamp and pruners and a stack of totes, moving branches to the barn freezer until the barn freezer was full, which took about 90 minutes, and after that there was nowhere to put anything. He kept cutting anyway because stopping felt worse. The thorns went through his gloves at the wrist and along the forearm, and after the first hour he stopped noticing individual scratches and started noticing the general condition of his arms. The headlamp made a circle about 4 feet across. Outside it, in the dark, the rows ran on for a quarter mile. At 2 in the morning he stopped and looked at what he had done. And it was not 1 full row. 3 years. 15% loss the first winter. 2 years of night shifts and a canceled seat in Billings and a column of numbers in a dead man's notebook that had gone down twice more since he'd taken it over. 3 companies waiting on volume he was standing in the middle of. And he was going to watch it fall off the branch, in the open, where everyone could see it happen from the county road. The county had been right after all, he thought. This ground was going to change hands, just not for any reason any of them had guessed. He was in the yard at 6:30 the next morning, dumping the barn freezer into totes he had no place to put, when he heard a truck downshift out on the county road and slow for his driveway. It was Tom Keller, backing a refrigerated trailer up the lane with one arm over the seat and his eyes on the mirror, taking it past the barn and setting it square in the yard like he'd measured the spot years ago. He got out, walked around the back, and through the doors. Eli knew that trailer. Tom rented it every August, from the same outfit in Livingston, for the week he shipped his own calves. That week started Monday. There was no speech. Eli would think about that later, that in 3 years of being told he was a fool, the moment it ended came without a single word of apology. "Your granddad loaned me equipment for 20 years, Tom said. "Show me where to cut." Eli stood there with a tote in his arms and his forearms in the condition they were in, and what he wanted to say was several things at once. So he said none of them, and pointed at the second row from the west fence. By 8, there were 4 more vehicles. Curtis Pryor had driven out from Bozeman on his day off with 2 of the Night Stalkers, because of a message Eli had left on Wednesday and never expected anything to come of. The teacher from town who had asked about bringing a group came instead with a carload of older students and a case of water and stayed all day. Ed Fowler, who had told him that Feeling doesn't pay property taxes, showed up in a clean shirt without explaining himself, and by noon, the shirt was finished. The man who managed the feed store, the one who had asked 3 years earlier whether Eli was going into ornamentals, came with his own pruners and did not bring it up. Not all of them came out of charity. A few came because the county paper had run a photograph and they wanted to stand next to the thing in it. A few came because Tom Keller had spent the previous evening on the phone, and Tom Keller was a man whose calls got answered. 1 or 2 came to see it fail up close. It didn't matter, they came. And here was the part nobody in that yard had expected, least of all Tom. Eli ran it. He did not stand back and let them work. He couldn't. Every person who picked up a pair of pruners was holding 4 years of the farm's future in their hand, because a fruiting branch cut in the wrong place doesn't just cost this August, it costs the wood that was going to carry next August, and the one after. So he stopped everything for the first 20 minutes and taught them. He walked the row with a branch in his hand and showed them where the cut went and why. He showed them what a spur looked like and what happened to a plant that got stripped by somebody in a hurry. He put people in pairs, one cutting, one running totes, and he moved down the line all morning correcting hands. When Ed Fowler took a whole liter off a mature female, Eli told him so, plainly, in front of everyone. And Fowler said he understood and did it right after that. Nobody argued with him. That was the strange thing. Somewhere between the first tote and the third hour, the yard had quietly agreed on something that the diner had been refusing to agree on for 3 years, which was that there was exactly one person on that property who knew what he was doing, and he was 19, and he was the one giving directions. Everyone wore gloves. The gloves were not enough. Sea buckthorn goes through the wrist and up the inside of the forearm, and by the second day the scratches had stopped being injuries and become a condition of employment. Tom, who had spent 30 years in barbed wire and thought he was past being impressed by a plant, looked at his own arms on the third evening and said something about the bushes that Eli decided not to repeat. The system found its rhythm. Cut branches went into the trailer within minutes, hard frozen overnight. And in the morning, the frozen fruit came off clean in batches over a tarp, releasing instead of bursting, exactly the way it was supposed to. Exactly the way Eli had read about for 3 years and never once seen with his own eyes. The first time a branch let go of its berries all at once, in a bright orange rush, the whole line stopped to watch it. Tom shipped his calves that Monday out of a neighbor's corral on somebody else's schedule, and never mentioned it. For nearly 2 weeks, the farm ran from before sunrise until after dark. Denise Carter came out on her days off and worked the tarp and did not once mention Billings. There were folding tables in the yard and food on them that Eli had not organized and never learned who had. At night, after everyone left, he walked the rows with a flashlight, checking what tomorrow held, and the trailer hummed behind him in the dark, and the sound of it was the best sound he had ever heard. The last cut came on the final day of August. The fruit was in cold, and every plant on that farm was still standing. Resolution: 968 words. The vehicles started coming while the crew was still in the rows. By the last week of August, there were 3 of them in the yard before 8 in the morning. A small health food company out of Bozeman, a truck sent up by Marcus Dowd's juice producer nearly 200 miles west, and a woman named Karen Voss, who represented a natural skincare brand and had driven in with a cooler, a notebook, and enough questions to stay the entire day. She got out, took in the yard, the trailer, the tarp, the tables, 40 people in the rows, and looked for someone in charge. What she found was a young black man scrubbing a harvest bin with a brush. She asked where she could find the owner. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "You're looking at him." She wrote in her notebook for the next 6 hours and did not leave until the light went. The first load went to Dowd. A second portion went out for testing and small batch processing into puree and powder because Eli wanted numbers on paper, oil content, acidity, solids, that he could put in front of a buyer instead of a story. He held back a share for himself. That share was where the shelf in Bozeman finally earned its keep. He worked with a commercial kitchen and came out with a tart syrup meant for sparkling water, sharp enough to make a person's face move, which was the point. A chef in town put the puree into a pan sauce and then into a dressing and asked for more. The seed and the pomace left over from pressing, the part that in most operations goes into a pile behind the building, went off in trial batches to be pressed for oil, because Eli had spent 2 summers putting $40 price stickers on exactly that oil and knew what happened to it after it left a farm like his. One harvest: juice, frozen fruit, puree, powder, syrup, oil. 6 things out of the same August. That was not cleverness. That was the whole architecture, and he had designed it before he ever put a plant in the ground. He did not want the farm standing on one buyer, because he had watched from behind a price gun what a single buyer's mood does to a producer nobody has ever heard of. If juice went soft, he could sell frozen. If the fresh market was thin, it could all be processed. If a customer never understood a raw sea buckthorn berry in her life, and most of them wouldn't, she could still meet it in a bottle, a powder, a sauce, or something she put on her face at night. Eli knew that because he had stood at that shelf and watched her do it. None of which made him rich. That was never the honest version. He still had debt. The truck still needed the transmission it had needed since the funeral and got it, and that was most of the juice check. Equipment broke. The harvest would have cost more in labor than any spreadsheet had told him it would. And the only reason it hadn't buried him was that half the county had worked it for nothing. Some buyers wanted volumes he could not come close to producing and lost interest when he told them the truth. Others quoted prices that would have been fine if you assumed nobody's arms had bled for 2 weeks. But the farm had crossed a line, and Eli could see exactly where it was. The rows were not an experiment anymore. They were revenue, and they were producing revenue while still doing the job he had planted them to do in the first place, which had never stopped for a single day of the 3 years. The west side held more soil than it had when he started. Behind the mature rows, the wind was measurably slower, and he had measured it. Snow that used to blow off the exposed ground and pile in the ditch now collected evenly across the field and stayed there until it melted into the place it had landed. The ground in the shelter of the shrubs held moisture further into July than anything else on the property, and that fall, Eli started trialing other things in those protected strips, using the sea buckthorn rows as a living windbreak, which was what they had been from the beginning, and what nobody had been able to see until they turned orange. Tom Keller came down the driveway alone in October and parked by the barn. Eli was cleaning harvest equipment. Neither of them said anything about the berries or the buyers or the weeks the whole county had spent talking about the Carter place. Tom looked west at the rows. "How much soil you figure those things are holding?" Eli set down the hose. "More than they did the first year." Then Tom wanted to know about the winters, whether the plants had really taken the cold or just been lucky in it. And Eli told him so far, and that so far was the only honest answer anybody had after 3 seasons. Tom asked what they drank. "More while they're young," Eli said. "Less once they're established, but not none." Tom nodded slowly at that, the way a man does when the answer is the one that proves you've been paying attention. Then he asked the question Eli had been waiting 3 years to hear. "Where'd you buy the plants?" Eli did not gloat. He had thought once or twice during the second winter about what he'd say if this ever happened, and now that it had, he found he didn't want any of it. He walked him through the layout instead. He explained the male-to-female pattern and how the wind he'd spent 3 years fighting was the same wind that carried the pollen. He told him about the 15% he lost the first winter and the drip line that cracked where he couldn't see it, and the deer that worked an entire row end to end. He described what 2 weeks of cutting frozen branches does to a person's forearms. And then he told him not to do it. "Not because it looks like money," Eli said. "Have a buyer before you have a plant. Make sure the crop fits your dirt and not somebody else's. And understand the labor, all of it, before you put in 10 acres of anything." Tom looked at him for a moment. "You talking me out of it?" "No," Eli said. "I'm talking you into doing it right." The following spring, he planted another section. Not the farm. A section, 1 more block, laid along the shoulder of the high ground where his grandfather's pages and his own soil tests agreed that the ground was still leaving. He had learned enough by then to be afraid of his own good year. A person who has just had one August like that is the most dangerous thing on his own property. And Eli had a notebook full of reasons to move slower than his confidence wanted to. He signed with a processor 40 minutes away instead of shipping raw fruit out of the region, which cost him a little on paper and meant that the value of what grew on the Carter place stopped at a building where people he knew worked. He hired 2 of that spring's high school graduates for the season and paid them what the work was actually worth. which was more than he had ever been paid to stock a shelf before dawn, and he taught them where the cut went and why before he let either of them touch a mature plant. The long-term plan was never to bury 75 acres in sea buckthorn. It was to build a diversified farm around the conditions the shrubs had created. Some of it would stay in forage. Some would carry annual crops in the sheltered ground behind the rows. Some would go into other perennials once he could afford to wait on them. And the sea buckthorn would go on being 4 things at once: windbreak, habitat, soil cover, and income, the way it had been since the first 11 days he spent on his knees setting out plants that looked like nothing. The brightest thing on the Carter place was easy to see. It was the orange every August on thousands of branches, so loud against the dry hills that people still slowed down for it. The change that mattered was harder to photograph. It was the soil that no longer crossed the county road in a haze every spring. It was the rain that went down instead of sideways. It was the snow that stayed where it fell. It was the fact that there were now places on that farm where a person could try something new because the wind reached them softened, which had not been true of a single acre when Eli inherited it. And it was a column of numbers in a cardboard notebook. He took the measurement in April, the same 4 places, spade and tape, the way he had every spring since the first one, and the way his grandfather had for 30 years before that. Year 1, it had gone down. Year 2, it had gone down. Year 3, it had gone down by an amount so small he had written it twice to be sure. He carried the last book out to the west edge, set it on the tailgate, and wrote the 4th figure under the 3 he'd added and the shaky handwriting above them all that said, "Still going down." It was bigger than the one above it. Not by much, by an amount you would have to know the column to notice. For the first time in 34 years, it had gone up. People described what happened on that farm as a young man getting lucky with a fashionable berry, and that was the small part of it. The real decision had never been which fruit to plant. It was that Eli refused to separate the health of the product from the health of the place that made it. He had spent 2 summers watching people spend real money on their own well-being, and he could not make the arithmetic work in his head. How a food could stand for anybody's long life if growing it left the ground weaker every year it was grown. So he went looking for something that could do both, something people would eat, something companies would buy, something that could survive a Montana winter on the worst dirt in the county, and something that would leave the farm stronger than he found it. There is a formula for how land like his has disappeared in this country, and every family it happened to could recite it. The ground gets used until it can't feed anybody. Then it gets sold, cheap, to the man across the fence, and everyone agrees afterward that it was simply what the market wanted. Eli did not beat that formula by holding on hard. He beat it by making the land worth holding. So the most valuable thing those strange, thorny rows ever produced was not juice, not powder, not oil, not the money. It was proof that farmland does not have to be exhausted before it turns a profit. That sometimes the best crop is not the one that takes the most out of the ground. It's the one that gives the ground enough time, enough shelter, and enough life to start giving back.